Hi everyone, this is my weekly update for this week, and I'm really conscious that there's going to be a bunch of people watching this who don't normally watch me do my thing due to this massive incident in South Africa. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk about the South Africa situation first, which is kind of the last thing I've been dealing with this week. Make sure that I share some information in a fashion that's consumable for people who may not really understand what happens in this world of data breaches. And then I'll go back and I'll do the other techie things as well. So if you're someone who regularly listens, we will do the techie things, but it's really important to understand what has gone on in South Africa and what I know about the incident, because there's a lot of people who are pretty worried about it. So as you might have seen me tweeting, and I blogged about this yesterday as well, there's been a big incident in South Africa relating to what is referred to as a master deeds database. Now, again, with sort of consciousness that there are people probably watching this who are not sort of familiar with the world of data breaches and what happens there, let me sort of take a step back and just for everyone's benefit, explain what often goes on. So we got a lot of stuff online these days, and we've got everything from accounts on websites to mobile apps that record things. Speaking to my phone now, that has a lot of mobile apps sending stuff to the internet. And of course, we've now got all of these IoT things as well, Internet of Things, which I'll talk more about later on. All of these are collecting data. A lot of this is going into databases online. A lot of times these databases are not very well configured. Other times these databases are backed up to publicly facing web servers, and this is what we'll get to in a moment. Other times there are vulnerabilities in the web applications themselves. So people have written usually poor code. Hackers come along, they break in, they take data out. And there are various reasons why people do this. So sometimes we see people break into systems because they then want to sell the data. They want to monetize it. Other times they do it because there's a challenge. Other times, again, like in the case we'll talk about South Africa, it's just literally leaked. There isn't even a hack. There is not some security thing that people have broken through. So anyway, these data breaches, they happen endlessly, every single day, over and over and over again. Just at untold numbers. And look, I mean, I look at this stuff a lot, but it continues to just astound me how many data breaches we see. So anyway, going back about 4 years, I started a project called Have I Been Pwned, which regular followers will be pretty familiar with. It's a data breach aggregation service. So a website gets hacked or data gets leaked or exposed somewhere publicly. Very often people pick that up and send it to me, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. And then I aggregate that and I make it searchable by those who've been impacted by the data breach. Because this is what we ultimately want to do. We want to make sure that people who have had the misfortune of being in one of these incidents, and I'm in about 11 at the moment myself, get to know about it and get to learn of their exposure. And it often comes as a massive shock to people because they go to my Have I Been Pwned system, they plug in the email address, and they go, right, I didn't know that LinkedIn had leaked my data, or Dropbox, or Kickstarter, or MySpace, or any of these really, really big names that have had serious hacks in the past. So this is the thing. There are data breaches. There is this thing called a data breach or a leak, or basically data being exposed in places it shouldn't be. There is this concept of people then picking it up, either hacking into it, or in some cases, like we'll talk about in a moment, picking it up from a publicly facing web server somewhere. And then there's the Have I Been Pwned piece, which is the let's make it searchable and let's try and do our best to make it, I guess, the best of a bad situation, for want of a better term. So that's kind of the background, and that alone spins many people out, that there's so much data floating around. There's almost 4.8 billion records in Have I Been Pwned, and that is one tiny slice of what is out there. Because I can only load the stuff that I know that actually gets distributed. There's all these other incidents that haven't turned up. We've heard Yahoo had a billion records breached out of their system last year. I've never seen that. Loads of other companies that we never even know have been breached, and they themselves don't know that they've been breached or leaked their data. So, and I'm checking my notes as well because I want to make sure that I cover all the important things here. So this happens. Now, because this happens so frequently, there are a lot of people coming across these sets of data. Now, again, sometimes they hacked out a system, sometimes they're leaked, sometimes it's an insider. He's unhappy with the company, takes the data, sends it out online. And there are a heap of people out there that trade, redistribute, share this information. Now, just as a point, since I mentioned that, that's not something that ever happens on my behalf. I never ever give anyone any data that I find or that is sent to me or anything like that. I don't want to see this being propagated any further. And I'm conscious that may seem a little bit unfair to some people because people do send me data, but it goes in a Have I Been Pwned, it does good things for people, and that's where it stays. Now, so there's a lot of people out there sharing this information around. I get just reams and reams of data from breach systems over and over and over again. I will have people pop up at times and they'll say, here's 100 data breaches, literally, because they will have a stash somewhere. Now, sometimes this is a personal stash. They've got it on their own machine and they go, here you go, 100 different breaches. Sometimes there are websites where these services or these breaches are aggregated. So there are public websites that you can go to, and it might be not just hundreds, sometimes even thousands of different incidents. Gigabytes, terabytes in some cases of data floating around that anyone can download. Now, as a result, it's like a fire hose of data that comes to me. So what tends to sort of happen is people send data, and sometimes it's just sort of a one-off, and I'll look at it, and very often it will have a name. So for example, let's pick a good one, LinkedIn. All right, so we know LinkedIn got hacked back in 2012. Their data started getting distributed around last year. First got sold, then it started getting distributed. Now, when that turned up, I go, okay, well, I know LinkedIn had an issue. We know they got hacked. I can verify this data. I can deal with this now. In many cases, there are huge amounts of records where the effort for me to process them is a lot higher. Now, I literally have hundreds and hundreds of different incidents that I'm still going back through. So when someone comes along and they say, here's one incident or here's 100 incidents, they tend to all go into a big stash, and at some point in time I get around to looking at them. And then the really high sort of priority stuff, so the things that are in the news that everyone knows about, like LinkedIn, I prioritize those. So anyway, endless streams of data coming. Now, back in March, someone sent me some data. And it was a database file, a database backup file called Master Deeds. And this went into my folder of all the other things along with the hundreds of other breaches. And I kept putting stuff in there. I travel a lot, so I tend to sort of try and find times between travel where I can sit down, look at stuff and process it. Now, fast forward to last week, and I'm running out of space on my hard disk. Like, I'm literally maxing out a terabyte disk, which is on the machine I do my processing on. And I start going through and trying to find the big stuff. Like, let's take this big stuff. A lot of it is either of absolutely no use for Have I Been Pwned, so it doesn't have email addresses. The only thing that goes into Have I Been Pwned is email addresses. So it doesn't have any email addresses, I can't do anything with it. Sometimes we're seeing other hacks of software, and we get software distributed around. No email addresses, nothing I can do with it. So I start going through the big stuff. And some of this stuff I managed to verify. So one of the big things, and I think this was about 70 gigabytes worth of data, was a breach called Victory Phones. And Victory Phone seems to be some sort of automated telephony company where they call up people with those recorded messages and go, hey, would you like to donate to your local senator or political party or whatever it is? So that was an incident where I went through and verified it, and reporters helped sort of get in touch with the company, notify them what happened. I could then deal with it. Now, in that case, that was called Victory Phones, which makes it really easy to then go to Google and search for Victory Phones. Oh, it's probably these guys. So anyhow, that was a big one. I managed to get that out of the way. So then I'm working back through my list of big breaches, and there's this Master Deeds thing, and it's 27 gigabytes, which is a sizable set of data. Only has about 2.2 million email addresses in it, though. And I know I just said like only 2.2 million, but when there's data breaches with tens or even hundreds of millions of records, obviously I'm going to prioritize the big stuff because they're all pretty much the same amount of effort. Whether there's 100 million records, 100 million records, or 100 records, same amount of effort on my behalf. This one has a much higher impact because there's a lot more people that get to learn about it and then protect themselves and do all the sorts of things we need to after a data breach. So anyhow, I got to this Master Deeds thing, and now I was actually traveling all this week. I was, somewhat coincidentally, in Sydney and in Melbourne doing security training, helping companies, in this case a financial institution and a large online trading site, help them not get hacked in future. In fact, often I go and see these organisations and they say, we got you in here so that you can help us not be on Have I Been Pwned. Okay, well that's not why I created it, but it's a good objective. So I was traveling, but I had Tuesday afternoon my time free, and I guess I probably should have maybe just taken some personal time, but instead I went, okay, let's actually trawl through and process this data. And I started looking closer at this master deeds data. Now, I had actually, before I left, several days before I left, I'd seen this file and I go, I should do something with this, import it into the local database that I use for processing and validation, imported it. Several days later, it was still importing. I had to stop it to go on the trip, picked it up again Tuesday. Now, when I started looking at it, I saw, first of all, sort of two things that stood out to me. So one was that there was no clear indication of source. So there was nothing that said, I mentioned Victory Phones. It didn't say Victory Phones or LinkedIn.com or anything where I can go, that's the site that I need to look at. They're the people I need to let know and say, maybe this is your data. Didn't have any of that on it. So that was number one. Number two is that it had a lot of references to South Africa. So there seemed to be a lot of South African people in there. And I'm looking at this data and nothing in there is giving it away. So for example, often I will look at a data breach and I'll say, well, it's interesting. I'm seeing an organization's name appear over and over again. So the organization's name might be in the email address because sometimes people put the name of the site they sign up with in the email address they use. There were no passwords, so I couldn't sort of look at the passwords and go, wow, I keep seeing like Acme Core over and over again. It wasn't that. And I had absolutely no idea what the data was. More than just that though, I had no idea where it came from. It was just in this big stash. And I don't record all the details of who sent me what. I just all goes into a stash and I deal with it later on. So I didn't know how long I'd had it for, who it came from. All I knew is it was a 27 gigabyte file with a bunch of South Africans in there. So what I ended up doing is putting out a tweet Tuesday afternoon. This is all my time, by the way. So Australia, in case you don't know, is in the future. So scroll back, I think about 10 hours or something for South Africa. So I've tweeted out, and this is sort of late in the day, my Tuesday, so I know South Africa's just waking up. And people start making suggestions. Because I said, look, it's called Master Deeds, it's got name, gender, birth date, this sort of stuff. People made a bunch of suggestions as to what it might be. It might be a deeds office, right? So like real estate property deeds. And I also shared the column names of the data. So this data is a MySQL backup. And the backup goes through and it creates the table, so it declares all the column names and what data types they are and how long the fields are. And then it goes through and inserts a heap of records afterwards. So I shared the column names as well, because between this, I'm thinking, all right, this will be enough for us to figure out what this is. Now, I think I kicked this off sometime late in my Tuesday afternoon. We had a bit of to and fro with people, and I ended up saying, look, if there's any journos in South Africa who specialize in tech, get in touch. Because journalists are very, very good at digging into these stories. I must write, actually, at some time why I use journalists so much. And it's not just to sort of get things press. It's because they are very, very good at finding the source of incidents like this, and they're very, very good at getting responses from companies. Now, let me talk about this for a moment as well, because this is one thing people often don't get. When there are data breaches, even when I'm confident of where it's come from, getting a response from a company can be a nightmare. It is so painful. And I've written reams and reams of stuff that regular followers would have seen. But things like, we've tried all the email addresses, we've tried Twitter, we've tried calling offices, not getting any reply. Or if you do get a reply, you get someone who thinks it's a shakedown, and they're saying, talk to our lawyers, or they're telling you to get stuffed. It is a thankless job trying to ethically report these incidents. And there's a whole other discussion about how bad that is. But anyway, that wasn't really relevant here because I didn't know who to talk to anyway. But it gives you a bit of a sense of why journalists are enormously useful for me doing what I do as well. So I sort of went to bed and I got up the next morning and I had a bunch of emails from various journos. And one of them was a journo called Tifo. I think it's Tifo Mojave. Apologies if I have murdered your name. I'm doing my best. I know I have a funny accent. So anyway, Tifo sent me a bunch of emails. And these sort of came in through the night. He's obviously been working on it all night, or my night at least. And he feels he started to track down the source. And what Tifo felt is he said, look, it looks like it could have come from a company called Dracor. Apologies again if I get that name wrong. And they are like a data aggregation. They call it data enrichment, which basically means get a bunch of data together, refine it, put it into some sort of format that can then be reused or in their case resold. And, he sort of had a sense around that. And we got on the phone. So he and I had a good chat on my Wednesday morning. Now, he didn't sleep at all that night. This bloke stayed up all night trying to figure out what was going on. And we basically went through this and figured out that it looked like it had some sort of relationship to Dracor. And as things sort of started to unfold, we then figured out, look, it's... well, I'm trying to make sure I get the right chronology here. And again, like I'm trying to do training at the same time as getting all these phone calls and emails. But we're sort of starting to figure out what's going on. He thinks it's Dracor. And as we go through the days, or as we go through my Wednesday and we go backwards and forwards, one of the things we learn is that someone has popped up, and I believe this person popped up and contacted Tifo and said, look, he has some information or some background. And bottom line is, it turned out to be the person who sent it to me. And with this person's permission, I don't know if it's a guy or a girl, the name is Flash, I think it's Flash Gordon, which is probably not the real name. This person said, look, they were the one that found it. I later managed to find that person in my DMs and go back and see that it was about March in this year that they sent me the data. So I'd been sitting on it for 7 months, which is not unusual. I got a lot of stuff there from 7 months, a year ago, whatever. And the really concerning thing, and this was sort of I guess, something that we didn't see coming, is that the data was still available online. And now this was where we started to join all the dots, where we went, hang on a second. So this was data that was actually on a web server somewhere in March, and it's still there in October, like 7 months later. And what we discovered as we sort of went to and fro is that this person had discovered the data published publicly to a web server. Now, let's just qualify what that means for folks who may not live, again, in this technical world. So obviously, we have this concept of web servers, and they serve web pages and images and videos and things like that, which is great. Occasionally, someone backs up their database and puts it on a web server. Nobody does this deliberately. It is an egregiously bad mistake. And it's egregiously bad because when you take a database and put it on a web server, someone else might download it. And the stuff that you have got in your database is generally not the stuff that you want other random people downloading off the internet. So it's a terrible thing, but it does happen. And I've been involved in many, many cases before where it's happened. A good example, and this is in the blog post. I didn't mention this. There's a big blog post about this South African thing. Good example is last year, in fact, bang on about a year ago, someone did a very, very similar thing where they found exposed data on the internet published publicly, and it turned out to be data from the Red Cross Blood Service in Australia. My data was in there, so I had information that had my name, my birth date in it. My wife's data was in there, it had her blood type. There are things like eligibility questions for donating blood. Things like, have you had at-risk sexual activity attached to a name, attached to an email address? Which is basically code for have you slept with a prostitute? And it was published there publicly. So this sort of thing happens. A few weeks after that, it was Michael Page, the global recruitment company. A few months after that, we're seeing databases for things like the Cloud Pets internet-connected toys. This is like toys with listening devices, record the kids, put them online. Their database was sitting publicly facing, shouldn't have happened without a password. So this sort of practice of publishing data publicly is by no means unprecedented, but it is a really serious problem. Now, I put out a tweet a couple of days ago. I think I quote tweeted someone, because someone was sort of talking about the African thing, and they said, South African thing, they said, this is a hack. And so, let us just be perfectly clear about this. This is a database published to a web server. This is not breaking through some vulnerability in software. This is not trying to guess someone's password and gain unauthorized access to their content. This is the web server doing exactly what the web server is designed to do. So this is sort of how it came about. And we discovered this data there. Now, the real concern then was that now we knew the data was still live. And we did not know that until then. We had absolutely no idea. All I knew is I had a file and a folder. So now we know the data's live, but at least we know there's an IP address. And this is what it was. It was, for the more technically inclined, it was an IP address with directory listing enabled, accessed over port 443. So it was normally that would be an encrypted connection. And this was alarming because this is the sort of thing that people find. Obviously, the person that sent it to me found it, but it's the sort of thing that a lot of people find. So we have seen so many cases where multiple individuals find the same exposed stuff. And this is one of the most concerning things about this case, in that I certainly have no idea who has accessed it. If they have web server logs, maybe they'll get some sort of an idea, and it will tell them that multiple parties have accessed it. And then we've got no idea what those parties actually did with the data from there. So that was really concerning. We found this IP address, and the trick then is that TIFO's trying to find who owns it to get the thing shut down. And I want to make sure he gets credit for this. Like, he genuinely tried his best to find who owns this, how can we get it shut down. The guy hasn't slept all night. He's tired, he's trying to track down the owner of it. It wasn't a simple task. Eventually he got it taken off. I think I said in my blog post about 10:30 Wednesday morning South African time. Now, keep in mind, this is after it had been exposed for at least 7 months. Now, I say at least because the date, the updated date on the file itself, or in fact, I'll rephrase that. In the directory listing on the web server, it said updated, and then there was a date that was about April 2015. So that's 2.5 years ago. So it could have been 2.5 years. Could have been longer, because the file could have been created and edited before then and then just updated later on. I don't know. But anyway, it had been exposed for a very long period of time, and then once we actually identified what it was and where it was exposed, it got taken down, I think from memory, certainly within a day. So he did work pretty quickly on that, which was good news. Now, that sort of brings us through to the next thing, where we figured out what it is, and then we get to this process of attribution. So whose data is it? Where did it come from? And he had obviously previously indicated he thought it was Dracor. And in fact, when I went back and had a look at some of his posts, I think he worded it quite well. He said, it looks like the data is the sort of data that Dracor collates and sells. And I forget his wording exactly, but clearly the intention was this looks like their product. Now, the thing is, they then sell their product. So they sell it to other organizations. And what we now know is that they sold it to a company called Jigsaw. And Jigsaw, in fact, I'm going to caveat that a little bit more carefully, and you'll see why in a moment. We identified that Jigsaw is the owner of the IP address. They had the data. It looks like the sort of data Dracor sells. We're not entirely sure that it did come from Dracor to Jigsaw, but all evidence seems to indicate that, and Dracor has not actually explicitly denied that either. So anyway, it's Jigsaw. They got all this data, and Jigsaw has consequently acknowledged that yes, it was them. It's a good thing that they've acknowledged it, because now we can start to have the discussion about, okay, cool, it's your server. What can we find out? Now, when I say we, this is not me. Like, I've done everything that I can in terms of bringing this to light. The folks that are now going to be dealing with this, and I'm making sure I get the names right because it's on my notes, is apparently Department of Home Affairs is investigating it, and a group called the Hawks, which sounds awesome, by the way. They are the Directorate for Priority Crimes Investigations. Now, this is important because this is where we may be going in terms of what happens next. Because the concern is that when you have this data, there could be all sorts of other crimes and things that happen as a result. I'll come back to that in a moment, though, because I don't want to finish the Dracor Jigsaw thing. So anyway, we've sort of fairly confidently identified that source. It's been reported, been taken down, which is the good thing. And now we're at this point where we've got to go, okay, what next? Like, what happens from here? So there's a few things. There were 2.2 million email addresses in the entire data set. Those email addresses are searchable in Have I Been Pwned. There are only email addresses in there. You cannot search by any other attribute. You cannot return any other attribute. It is just another day on Have I Been Pwned, and it's in there with the other almost 4.8 billion records. So a bunch of people can search and find their email address in there. And that will at least give them explicit confirmation that yes, they had data there. The challenge now is that there are a lot of other people who can't discover it by Have I Been Pwned. And I want to put a sense on the scale. And also I want to explain the scale numbers, because we've heard several different numbers from me over this period of time. The original numbers that I shared, I said, look, I've been loading this data. I had to turn it off before I got on the plane, but it got up to about 31 million something. And 31 million or 30 million was the number that sort of started to stick in the press. Now, one of the problems, again, for the more technically inclined here, is that when you insert large volumes of data into a MySQL database, when there is an index involved, it goes very slow because as the data goes in there, it gets indexed so it's rapidly searchable, makes searching very quick, makes inserts very slow. I went and loaded that data again, I think the night before last, which was probably Wednesday night, and I killed the indexes. So I got rid of the indexes, loaded the data in, it just went bang. Like 3 hours or something, it did the whole lot instead of like 3 days and it failed. Now what I learned once I loaded it is that the number was north of 60 million, which is a lot. There's no way sugarcoating it. It's just a ginormously large amount of data. And so we learned it's about 60 million. And what I did at the time is I went into MySQL, which is the database platform, went into their little visual GUI thing, and I went to the table inspector, and the table inspector said 60 point something million. And I shared that figure. And I also ran one query, and the query that I wanted to run was let's get the breakdown of deceased people versus alive people. Because when we see a number like 60 million, and there's only 55 million people in South Africa, you start to go, hang on a second, like what's going on? Now I ran that number and I shared a tweet with deceased versus alive. And it was only sort of yesterday that I was looking at those numbers again going, like this doesn't add up. Why am I seeing about 60 million South Africans in the MySQL inspector? And then I've run this query and I'm seeing about 57 million alive and 9 million deceased. Numbers don't add up because that's like 66 million. So just earlier today, I ended up putting out a tweet and I said, MySQL people. So I do a lot of Microsoft-y things. MySQL is generally a different stack. I don't normally work with it. So I said, hey, look, folks, I'm seeing a different result when I query the data as opposed to when I'm in this little visual thing which says 60. And someone explained that, look, actually, the visual thing is just an estimation. The query is what gets you the actual number. Now, I've put an update on the original blog post, but what it boils down to is there's actually north of 66 million people. So it was out by about 10%. So this is the right number. And in fact, what I've done is I've screen captured the queries. I've put the queries in there and the results so that everyone can see it. So there's about 66 million something. So that's the scope as we know it today. Now, the challenge next is, there's sort of a couple of things. One of the challenges is, what do we do? So, what do we do when it is a significant portion of the country? Incidentally, the youngest person in there, I just ran another query on this, the youngest person in there seems to be almost 18, which again kind of makes it even weirder because if there's 66 million records and 57 million of them are alive, but there's only 55 million in the country and a bunch of them are kids, where's the other data? I don't know. This is what will come out, I imagine, in the investigation. So, the challenge now is, okay, we've got that many people, we've sort of run the query, what's going to happen next? And this is where I honestly don't have a good answer, because if this was a normal data breach, if this was LinkedIn, you'd go, just go change your password. Change your password wherever you've used it, you'll be fine. But a password is a mutable attribute. You can change it. The data in this master deeds data is immutable. So we've got things like government issued IDs, which is the thing that actually has the age in it as well. We've got things like names, physical addresses, that's stuff that doesn't change. And this is all stuff that's used for identity verification. Now, I'm not sure exactly how it works in South Africa, but certainly in many parts of the world, if you go in to get a loan, the sorts of information that they asked for is the sorts of information that is in that file. If your telephone company calls you up, we want to sort of talk about your phone bill or something, we need you to identify yourself. Please give us your government issue ID, your address, your date of birth, and your name. Well, that's all in the data. So what do you do when what looks to be pretty much the entire country's identity verification attributes have been redistributed publicly? And I don't know. This in many ways is unprecedented. The closest precedent I can think about, actually, and Journo's always asked this, I go, have you ever seen this before? Closest precedent I can think of is the Philippines Election Commission. I think it was just earlier last year. So they're called COMELEC. COMELEC had about 55 million people exposed. They've got 110 million in the country. And they had things like, it wasn't the same data for everyone, but they had passport numbers, parents' names, biometric data, like fingerprint data. So it's a major issue, and I honestly don't know what's going to happen next in terms of how South Africa is going to deal with this. But again, look, we've got the likes of Department of Home Affairs and, of course, the Hawks looking at this. So hopefully these guys will be able to at least take a lead on it. Now, let me change pace a little bit because I want to talk about one other thing and then I'll finish with the South Africa stuff and do my techie things. There's got to be a really serious question asked, and this is not just a South Africa thing, but everywhere, about whether or not we want private companies aggregating data about citizens with their consent and selling it to other people. Now, I'm not, frankly, too sympathetic to the organisations that do this. I am a little bit sympathetic to Dracor because they never saw this coming, came out of the blue. They had their CEO on, who's been interviewed in a few things, and Chantel, was talking on a radio program as well. I did an update to the original blog post, put her interview in there, and she's been absolutely blindsided by this. So I have some sympathy in that regard. But in that radio program, you sort of hear the presenter. He's kind of, or the host, he's pretty much incredulous. He's going, why do you have this data? Like, who gives you the right to have this data? Are you accredited? Oh, no, we're not a credit agency. Did you get consent? Well, no one actually gave them consent. And this is the concern, where there doesn't seem to be any control on the ability for an organisation like Dracor to collate everyone's data, then to sell it to someone else. And yes, it does seem like it was Jigsaw who ultimately screwed up and leaked that data, but someone gave it to him in the first place. And there has to be a question asked, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. Do we actually want to do that? Do we want to allow a private enterprise to collate all the sorts of data about people that is then needed in order for them to prove who they are? And I don't even know all the places it's come from. I've had people contact me and say, look, I searched for my email address and have I been pwned, found I was in the Master Deeds database. I only ever gave that email address to, for example, a government department. Why is it now in a private company's database and they're selling my information? Now, this is very different to somewhere like, say, Europe. So Europe is very, very privacy conscious. And what I love about Europe, and they've got some really big changes coming up next year as well, is this concept of personal data. You own your personal data. Other people don't. You can go to private companies holding your data and say, I would like you not to have my data. And those private companies have got to get consent to have your data. So it's sort of all about face in places like South Africa and, frankly, like the US and Australia as well. This is by no means are we doing it right and everyone else has screwed it up. Europe seems to be pretty good. We're not real good in much of the rest of the world. So that's sort of a real concern, and I hope, if nothing else, out of this exercise, that question gets asked. And we start to say, who do we want holding personal data, which no matter where you are in the world, really should belong to the individual whose data it actually is? So look, honestly, that is everything I know about the incident. It's all online on my blog post. A few people have said, well, will you talk to law enforcement if they ask? Well, yeah, of course I will. I talk to law enforcement all the time about these sorts of things. They know where to find me. I'm very easily discoverable. So that will be something which plays out possibly over even years. It's just a major, major thing. And here we are. There's just nothing more to say on it. All right, so I'm going to move on. That was the South Africa stuff. If you were just interested in that, feel free to go away. If you want to hear some techie stuff that's maybe a little bit happier and more forward-looking, stay here, because after the next thing I'll talk about, we're going to talk about the happy stuff. But the next thing I'm going to talk about is IoT, Internet of Things. Now, I touched on Internet of Things before, and I mentioned sort of teddy bears and listening devices and things. A lot of stuff goes wrong with IoT. Just things that I've been involved in. We've seen the teddy bears I mentioned before. We've seen the Nissan Leaf, where anyone could control anyone else's car. Someone in one of my workshops found that. When I say control the car, they could turn the temperature on and off. They could control physical things, being the climate control. Pull back trip history, pull back battery status, stuff that you should never be able to do. We have seen other incidents not related to me, which have been things like there was a dishwasher with a web server that had it's hard to even say it, a dishwasher that had a web server with a directory traversal bug. Yeah, dishwasher with a web server. Think about it. This was actually a Miele dishwasher. We have seen things like we had the Lifx light bulbs, Aussie invention, so it pains me to say it. Lifx light bulbs leaked Wi-Fi credentials so you could get into the account. We have seen, what's a nice way of putting this? Devices that loving adults may use in their own private time between each other that happen to be internet connected, leaking usage patterns associated back to the identity of the user. So basically you can figure out what sort of kinky stuff people are getting up to. This is just an amazing time. So anyway, I have done a Pluralsight course with my friend Lars Klint. Lars and I have done many Pluralsight courses before. This is a play-by-play course called Emerging Threats in IoT. Now, we actually recorded this when we were over in Oslo for the NDC conference back in June. It's only just gone live, but it's got a whole bunch of stuff about what is going wrong with IoT and some of the stuff we got to do to fix it as well. And it's things like, you know, we've got to be really conscious that with IoT, we have all of these different classes of risk. So for example, we have a class of risk which is, like with the cloud pets, data that's collected, put on a web server, and then lost. There's one good example. We have a different class of risk, which is more the Nissan situation, which is the devices can potentially give other people control of physical aspects of it. So there's that side of the risk. There are other risks as well where once there is physical proximity, things can go wrong, such as with the connected toilet. And yes, I did just say connected toilet. So there's a company called Lifx, Japanese company, Lifx. They make a toilet called the Hsts. The Hsts is a connected toilet, which apparently you need, who would have thought? And it had a default pin on the Bluetooth. So if you could get within proximity of the Bluetooth, you could connect to the toilet, and I actually use this in a lot of my talks, it's an epic finale. And if you had proximity and you had control, you could activate the bidet or air dry functions, causing discomfort or distress to users. True story. So that's there in the IoT Pluralsight course. Look, these sort of play-by-play courses are shorter. This one I think is about 57 minutes, just under an hour. They're easy watching, they're not deeply technical. It's a good sort of lunchtime thing or while you're on the train to work. And then if you really want to spend 5 hours learning SQL injection, there's another course about that. So go and check that out, that's pretty awesome. Now let me talk about something that I'm actually really happy to have put out, and this is the happy part of a talk that's otherwise, or an update that's otherwise been a little bit depressing in some ways. And this is the 6-step happy path to HTTPS. Happy. Now, let me explain why I've done this. We are seeing web browsers constantly push websites more and more and more towards HTTPS. So HTTPS, look, I mean, we've had this around for the last 20 years, but it has been slow on the uptake for many reasons. Things like cost, well, we've solved that with Let's Encrypt and Cloudflare. Things like effort, we've solved that with Let's Encrypt and Cloudflare as well. It's easy to get certificates these days. And various other things that slowed us down. But we sort of reached this tipping point. In fact, earlier this year, I wrote about how we'd reached the tipping point. And now it's much easier to get HTTPS on all your things. And one of the things that's sort of driving this is the browsers, as I said, holding websites to more account. So this is stuff like in January, Chrome and Firefox started having visual indicators if a web page was loaded over an insecure connection and it had a login form or a credit card form. Because what they're saying here is you're about to do something sensitive on this page. If you do that, you don't know that the page hasn't been modified by an attacker. And that means the attacker might get your credit card information or your credentials. That is bad. We're going to put a little thing on there which says this is not secure. And that was a really big move in the right direction, but it was only one step of the whole way that Chrome and the other browsers will go as well. Months ago, Google said, when we launch Chrome 62 in October, we are going to start to show a not secure warning on every page that has a form once data is entered into the form. And we're going to show it on every page that's HTTP if you load it in incognito mode, because when you're in incognito mode, you have a higher expectation of privacy. Now, we've known about this for ages. It is still taking a lot of people by surprise. So I wanted to write something to make it more accessible to get HTTPS on your site easy and right, because these are not always the same things. And in fact, at the start of this blog post, I show my mate, I shouldn't call him my mate, there's a backstory, a guy who was an SEO guy, and he talked a lot about how you don't need HTTPS, and then I explained how you do, and he changed his mind and he tried to get it, and he had lots of warnings and things like that. So, you know, what often happens is people do try to go secure, and they have these little nuanced glitches which then take away the padlock and things like that. So I want to sort of cover some of the things. I'm looking at the blog post here. Some of the things I spoke about in this blog post, and particularly talk about the 6 steps, because I wanted to break it down into consumable bites for everyone. And the first thing is that obviously you've got to get a certificate. All right. Now, I've mentioned Let's Encrypt. I've mentioned Cloudflare. These are both awesome at making certificates available everywhere. I use both of them. I prefer Cloudflare because Cloudflare is a reverse proxy, which means that they sit in the middle of your traffic. That means they can do lots of really, really cool things. For example, they've got 118 edge nodes around the world. They can cache all your stuff in a location that is close to your audience, so stuff goes fast. Because they're a reverse proxy, which means that every time someone browses a website, like my website, like troyhunt.com or Have I Been Pwned or any of these, you're connecting to an edge node which can look at your traffic. We'll come back to the good and bad bits about that. And then it can send some of it onto the origin to make requests from the server. It can return other stuff directly from that edge node. This is awesome for stuff like caching. So we can make sure that rather than requests having to go all the way to the origin server, so say my blog, it runs in Amsterdam. And I'm down here in Australia, which, as you may know, is on the other side of the world to everything. If I had to make a request to my blog without Cloudflare, I'd be going all the way around the world to that server. Responses come all the way back. Instead, I'm just jumping to a nice, convenient location here in Australia. So stuff's fast. Because they can intercept the traffic and inspect it, they can do things like apply firewall rules as well. They can block nasty stuff. Have I Been Pwned improved enormously when I put Cloudflare around about a year ago, because I could start to use the firewall rules to block nasty traffic that was spiking my CPU utilization, causing me to scale out, causing me to pay more money, and making the performance unpredictable. So Cloudflare is awesome. Starts at free as well. So my blog runs on the free one, which is plenty. Or of course, Let's Encrypt on your server, and then you're just still communicating directly to your origin server, but you've got a certificate. So those guys, that's the first bit. Now, number 2, you're going to have to 301. So every time you make an HTTP request, it is going to have to go back to the browser and say, no, here's a 301 permanent redirect, here's a location header, go and request it securely instead. Now you can do 301s very easily in the app itself. I mentioned in ASP.NET, you can do things like URL rewrite, which is simple. Every other framework has a way of doing it. It's a no-brainer. If you're through Cloudflare, there's a button and you press it and the little thing slides across and it goes, magic, we're done. Any HTTP request that comes in, I'm going to redirect it. So there's that. That was the second part of the 6-step happy path. Number 3, HSTS. This is a great time to talk about HSTS. So HSTS is HTTP Strict Transport Security, sometimes referred to as STS, which is just Strict Transport Security. In fact, the STS header is just Strict Transport Security. And this solves the problem that we have with just a 301, because just a 301 means that you get to make an insecure request over a connection which you're worried could be man in the middle. This is the whole reason we have HTTPS in the first place. Insecure request, then server comes back and goes, now do the secure thing. What HSTS allows you to do is return a header to say, once you see this header, always load the site securely, or at least for this many seconds from now. But then you can go further and you can say, let's also preload. So let's add a little preload keyword, and then let's go to hstspreload.org and tell it that we always want to load this site securely. And then Chrome and Firefox and the Microsoft browsers as well, yes, even those ones, will take that preload list and bake into their binaries the fact that you must always make a secure connection. This is awesome. You'll see that Have I Been Pwned does that. You cannot possibly ever load Have I Been Pwned insecurely in any browser that you've downloaded within the last, I think I added it about 2 years ago. It's great. It's always going to be secure. The timing of this is epic because only earlier this week we had the WPA2 crack attack vulnerability, which incidentally is awesome research, very, very clever stuff. But as part of demonstrating the crack attack vulnerability, the bloke who did the work said, what we're going to do is we're going to intercept Match.com traffic. And Match.com is a dating site. We're going to intercept traffic. We're going to use SSL strip to always keep the connection HTTP for the client. And then what we're going to do is we're going to steal credentials. And the only reason that worked is because Match.com isn't using HSTS. Now, if they had HSTS, which would enforce a secure connection the entire time, that demo goes out the window. And okay, they could have gone on and used a gazillion other websites, that that website, so your websites, the ones that you control, can be permanently secure by default using HSTS. So that's really, really important. Go and do that. I see a lot of HTTPS sites that aren't doing it. There are some caveats, but read the blog post. Incidentally, you can add that header very easily if you're in ASP.NET land using nwebsec, which is a free NuGet package. If you're going through Cloudflare, there's another toggle. You turn it on. And again, this is the joy of having Cloudflare actually man in the middle of your traffic. Oh, I did say I'd talk about the bad things there as well. So even today, someone left me a comment, I think on this blog post actually, and they said, I'm really worried about this. Cloudflare is going to intercept my traffic. I was like, well, yeah, this is kind of what a reverse proxy does. Like I have to trust them with my passwords and everything. Well, yeah, but you also trust them with your DNS, or you trust someone else with your DNS, and then you trust someone else to run your website. You've got to decide whether you want Cloudflare to be in your chain of trust or not. And if you don't, well, don't use them, but then you won't get all of this other stuff, and you got to make a decision about it. Incidentally, Cloudflare is either the world's largest web asset or second to Facebook. It's somewhere around that level. They've got thousands and thousands of sites that run through them. They are massive. If they screw this sort of stuff up, it would just be absolutely catastrophic. We're not seeing that happen. I do genuinely believe they're trying to do the right thing, and so far they've done a pretty good job of it. All right, so that was HSTS. Moving on, that was 3. Number 4, changing insecure scheme references. So the problem with the SEO bloke who I mentioned just before is you got an HTTPS page and then you put something on there not over HTTPS. So this is called mixed mode or mixed content. And the problem you got now is that if you put an image in there, for example, and the image loads into the page insecurely, you lose your green HTTPS, you lose your padlock, you lose your green secure. These are the Chrome indicators. Other browsers have slightly different indicators. And the reason you lose them is because we can now no longer be confident that the entire page is secure. It's not. Like the image could have been man in the middle. There are interesting nuances though, because if we were to load, say, a script, then what would actually happen if we embedded the script insecurely? The script would not load. So the image, it loads. The script would not load. The reason why is because an image is passive content. You can't do anything with an image. It just sits there. A script, you can own someone sideways with a script because now this is active content. You can run your own program within the script and do everything from change form actions through to pop up models and ask for credentials through to just basically totally rewriting the page because you've got control of the DOM. So the script won't load, which means you get to keep your green bits, but then in Chrome at least, you get the little shield up the top right-hand corner of the screen, which says, there's a little shield, it's got a little icon, and you click on it and it says, hey, we've blocked unsafe scripts. You can load them. If you do, then other visual indicators change to show that it's really, really bad. Point is that you've got to update all of those insecure references. Now, if you are living in a Cloudflare world, there's a button. Again, a button, because they can intercept the traffic. And the button says automatic HTTPS rewrites. And what you can do with those is you can say, I want to automatically change all of my HTTP references to HTTPS. And it's a bit smarter than that too, because they actually go and check that the resource can load over HTTPS before they do that. So that's very clever. Now that was number 4. Now number 5, and this is where it starts to get really cool in places that people don't know that it's really cool. We can add an upgrade insecure. Try it again. It's really cool. I've got to get it right. We can add an upgrade in secure request content security policy, also known as a CSP. Now here's how this works. You can have a CSP either as a response header, it's content-security-policy, or as a meta tag on your site. Now if you add this CSP and you go through and you say content security policy upgrade in secure requests, when your browser loads it, what's going to happen is if it sees any content on that page loaded insecurely, it will upgrade it and it will make it a secure connection. So that the thing in the area we just spoke about before, like step 4 of the happy path, where I said go through and update all your references, if you miss one, this fixes it for you. And this is awesome. Most people don't know you can do this. It's super, super cool because it solves the problem. And it's even better than that too, because once you have that, if you have other content that cascades down through other hosts and other domains, then it applies to that as well. And in fact, I originally started using this on my blog, I think earlier this year, maybe last year, because Discuss, the commenting engine, I was embedding that properly over HTTPS, and at some point they stuffed up and they changed one of their references to HTTP, and my blog started giving warnings, and it was problematic. Now, I could have waited for them to fix it, and they did fix it pretty quickly, or I could add upgrade and secure requests, and that policy of upgrading everything in secure cascaded all the way down to them, and bang, just fixed my problem like that, which is awesome. Now, here's the bit that's less awesome. It doesn't work on Microsoft browsers. I know. HSTS works on Microsoft browsers. Upgrade and secure request doesn't. Now, Edge actually does implement many aspects of CSP Level 2, but unfortunately, neither Edge nor Internet Explorer implements upgrade and secure requests. Now, this is why we still have to get our references right. So by all means, add the response header with the CSP thing, but you've still got to do the step 4 of the happy path as well, which is make sure your references are right. But there is another way, and this is part 6 of my happy path, and this is the one that's super, super cool. One of the things you can do when you have a CSP is you can report violations, and it has this construct called report URI, report-URI. So you create your CSP, you say, look, upgrade and secure requests, etc. You can create another CSP, so you can have 2 CSPs on one page. Another CSP, and I'm going to make sure I explain this right here, which is a content security policy report only. And report only does exactly what it sounds like it'll do. It'll report, but it won't block. And in that CSP, you can say everything must be HTTPS. Now what happens is if it's not HTTPS, then you can report the violation. So here's what happens with your 2 CSPs. You've got one CSP which says upgrade everything insecure. That will happen. That is an enforced policy. You then have another one that's a report only which says everything must be HTTPS, so slightly different nomenclature there, different syntax too. If you violate it, then send a report. So the awesome thing about this is that you set all your requests to make sure they go over HTTPS, all your embedded stuff. You then go through and you add the upgrade and secure requests response header, so that will make sure, at least for sort of Chrome and Firefox, everything gets upgraded. And then you go through and you do the reporting as well. So if you did miss anything in step 4 of the happy path, the one where you go HTTPS, then you'll get a report and you'll get told. And you can go back to your website and you can fix that reference so that even Internet Explorer and Edge don't get warnings. How awesome is that? Like, that is really, really cool. And then in there, I talk about the service run by my mate Scott Helm in the UK called Report URI. And you can go to report-uri.io, you can create a free account, and then you can configure your site to lodge the CSP violation reports to his service. And then you go in there and you look at your dashboard, because he's got graphs and charts and things like that, and you see every single one of your pages which has got insecure stuff in it and what the insecure thing was. And what I love about this is that everything I've just described in that 6-step happy path, first of all, is free. So you can get into it starting for free. Stuff like Cloudflare you can pay more money for if you want to have advanced stuff. But you can get started for free. For a small site, or say a site like my blog, for example, you can do this easily in an afternoon. The whole thing knocked off. The longest bit is going to be waiting for DNS propagation if you go Cloudflare. I do then go on and say, look, let's be fair, there are cases where this gets more complex. If you've got a really large website, for example, it gets more complex. Try doing this for Stack Overflow. In fact, I linked to the Stack Overflow piece. I think it was written by Nick Craver. And it's like mind-blowing how hard it is for I think they're like the 50th largest website or something in the world now. Certainly top 100, or top 200. They're massive. So it is harder for a site like that. Let's not sugarcoat it. But also that there's not many websites in the top 200, in the world. So yeah, horses for courses, but for the vast bulk of websites out there, particularly the smaller stuff, this is a no-brainer, and I really hope that people take this on board and they use it to upgrade more of their things. I'm already getting feedback from people saying, yep, we just went and did this, particularly with Cloudflare, because it's very, very simple. Happy days. So this is really cool. I'm going to start getting a lot of mileage out of contacting organizations where you see the not secure thing because they've got a form and going, I just went to your site and it told me I'm not secure. Is there a problem? Should I know about something? And I did this in January with the likes of Qantas as well. And you know what? They upgraded the security. The public shaming of it does actually help. Change is made. All right, this has been massively long, so the last thing to wrap up. This week I'm sponsored by Barclays Stack Hacker. So I've had Barclay there multiple times before. I really appreciate those guys continuing to support me. I'm now booked out, I think, pretty much until Christmas Day, which is really cool. And then I got to figure out what to do over the Christmas period because all the timings and people in the office, etc., changes a little bit, and different sponsors like different times of year. But I'll always have something interesting in there, and it won't be those lousy stinking ads. I'll tell you that much. Thank you very much for watching. If you are a South African who doesn't normally watch this stuff and you've listened through to here, look, I hope it's been useful, and I hope I've been able to give everyone some information, if not information they can action. I know there's not a lot you can do, but hopefully it helps explain everything I know about the situation, and it helps people move forward from this. Thanks for watching, guys.